Hello. Hello, hello, hello.
It's like the intro for everything.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. So, we're going to go back into our conspiracy theories in part two. I left off kind of touching on, like, lizard people after we were getting to the close on her topic. So I guess I'll start off just kind of going in on, like, what the lizard people are. Because obviously I was already talking about them a lot. I couldn't help myself. But so the lizard people, basically, the theory is they're like snake people. They look like lizards, honestly. I don't really have to go into much detail. You can imagine yourself. Anyway, the main thing that I'm referencing here is, like, you should really look into it. Now, it is a really freaking long video, but it's extremely, extremely fascinating. But it's a little hard to watch. But it's really interesting with the information that's in it. But it's like the interview with the lizard woman. And anyway, her name in the interview is Lacerda. And so basically, what they are is, like, they're native, like, aliens, so to speak. So they were actually, they call themselves native Terrans. So basically, they were actually born here and evolved on this planet. And they say that we were actually not originally from this planet. And so that's where I got earlier from she referenced that the humanoid, like, aliens were from Procyon. I'm probably saying that wrong. But then she said she didn't know much about the other reptilian species, which I think is interesting, that she knows so much about the human species, but she doesn't know much about the other reptilian species. So what I'm referencing here is there was a big war, apparently, long ago when the dinosaurs were here, and that's what that whole, like, cataclysmic type event was actually, like, war on planet Earth from these two groups, like the humans and this other, like, lizard alien species that has nothing to do with these lizard people that are native to planet Earth. So basically, there was a war because Earth is obviously really abundant in materials and all that sort of stuff. So, like, really, copper is super valuable because it has a lot of, like, energetic properties, and you can supposedly use it to, with science that we don't have, I guess, according to this Lacerda. She said that you can turn copper into, like, other, like, elements or something. So I'm not really sure. But anyway, so, like, the humanoid species apparently were trying to make peace with the other lizard species that were on this planet, like, obviously, like, mining or something, I don't know. But anyway, so the humanoid species obviously took DNA and put us on this planet, and so we're not exactly like them. That's why she called, like, them, like, aliens, but looked like us, because we weren't exactly like them. So anyway, they weren't able to make peace, so then there ended up being a war, and then that's what happened on planet Earth, was, like, like, the big cloud that had happened. And so she said that, like, the traces of, like, the, like, sediment that they find on, like, Earth, from what they think was, like, meteor hitting the planet Earth, she said, well, basically, you guys in science couldn't tell, and how could you know that that was actually, like, bombs going off in our atmosphere and shit. So it's like, that's a theory that she was talking about, which is like, interesting. And so basically what happened is some of the humans at the time died off, and some of the animals, and obviously dinosaurs died off, mostly because of the cloud. Not really because of much of the radiation, but she did say that the radiation from that actually helped their species evolve more into what their species is today, which was interesting because I don't know exactly, like, how it helped us. She didn't really go into that, because in the whole interview it's really condescending, which I find interesting, because she talks about how, like, after their whole evolution process, they had, like, three factions that were kind of like human-like, where, like, they divided each other up, and like, it was this race and that race and this race, and then, like, they had wars, and then eventually they, came together with their own evolution of science and manipulated their genes, and then they say they took out the gene of, like, basically not like having any ill will towards another species, or you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I find that interesting because it's like, why in this whole interview is she like talking about like humans are like gross and stupid and dumb? And it's like, I get it if we weren't native and we did take over your planet, but also it's like, if you did take that gene away or that thing that makes you like not hatred towards other species, why would you be like condescending the whole time? Especially in the interview, they have like long names and like that you can't really pronounce it, and to them it's really rude if you can't pronounce their name properly. So it's like the fact that you know that you are offended by certain things like that, but then you're gonna go and have an interview with another human and then blatantly like trash humans. I just found that interesting.
I don't know. I feel like it kind of makes sense in their defense because I feel like it's one thing to say like I don't have actual hate towards anybody. I have no like grudges, but another thing to be like, but honestly, I just don't like you.
Yeah, I guess I know that.
Because like
Yeah.
I have those feelings towards people, and it's like literally like no hate to you. There's no reason behind it. It's like I'm not gonna be like rude to your face, but also kind of like you have shorter patience. You're just like, oh,
That's
okay.
basically what she's saying. You guys are stupid. You guys don't understand your science yet. You guys don't even understand like where you came from. We figured that out like fairly fast, like where we came from and what our purpose is. And enlightenment happens when you hit about 18 years old. And that is a natural process that we all go through. And that's when you like pick your name. And like, you guys, if you're really interested in this topic, it really goes into detail. And I'm only touching on like the surface here. And so if this is at least interesting to you, definitely look into it. But it's just like, it's interesting enough because like especially with the theory of like we're not actually from here, and we already touched on that a little bit, where it's like you know doesn't necessarily feel like the right atmosphere or the right environment. We always, you know, humans as a, I honestly feel like person like a whole always have this longing for somewhere else, and it's like, where does that come from if home is here? You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's like, I feel like a lot of us gets those mixed feelings, especially if we have DNA from our human ancestors from other galaxy or whatever, and DNA, let's say, from apes on this planet. So it makes sense how you're a little confused. You're like, I feel like at home here, because you have, you know, some like things there, and you also have like your human self. You're like, this is like not what I need, you know? And this is all like theories, by the way. So it's just like that's interesting in itself to like, you know, a whole little spin on like how the dinosaurs actually died. But also like it's interesting too because she goes and talks about her anatomy, and like that is kind of what caught me on like, okay, I could see how they actually evolved on this planet and how we maybe didn't. Especially how you talked about earlier, where it's like you can't be in the sun too long, you can't be out of the sun too long, you can't have too much moisture, you can't have not enough moisture. You know, it's like all of these things where our planet doesn't really offer that consistently in one place. Whereas, like, obviously, it does offer like sun consistently in one place, and it offers water in one place consistently. You know what I mean? So it's like, in terms of like the lizard people, like, you know, she talked about how, you know, they did have like more like scaly skin, and then they also have this like plating down there that goes down their spine, and that when that heats up in the sun, it like circulates their blood, and it feels really pleasurable, almost like sex. If they would, she compared it to like how sex feels to us. So it's just like that would make sense that if like, you know, the sun that you go out into makes you feel so good. And I would, now that you say that, I can see how they have a little bit of resentment towards humans, considering they are all underground now. Obviously, they have the technology to survive down there because they obviously want to keep themselves protected in secret. But like, I could see how they have resentment when they're underground. There are artificial light rooms that are huge, but still not the sun. You know, and like, can you imagine like going into an artificial light room and just like feeling okay, then when and never really being able to go out into the sun, and then thinking like, God, I don't know. I guess I could see how they would hate humans if they were real.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really interesting, and also like, you know, it is one of those interviews. It's like, I'm having this interview, like, fully well knowing that nobody's gonna like believe me, but if you do, your race really needs it, and like, because there's apparently like a war for genes also going on, like on our planet Earth right now. Like, there's alien threats that they say that are like coming down and want to like steal DNA and all this kind of crazy stuff. So it's like, it goes really in detail into a lot of other stuff, which is like really. I feel like there's conspiracy after conspiracy after conspiracy that's like linked in like inner Earth and also these lizard people. It's like they really wanted to like create a story where it fits in everywhere, you know? So it's like, it's easy to get on that mind track. So it's just like, those are interesting people. So yeah, that's my lizard story, people. I really recommend like looking into that if you want. We'll leave some like links below for all of the stuff that we're talking about too.
Right.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll link that podcast with my last one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
That
okay,
one was
what's
awesome.
your next one?
My next one is, surprise, surprise, spontaneous human combustion.
You know, that's so funny that you say that. Is that the one that you said?
That's the one that I was like, you're not gonna be surprised.
You guys, we obviously have a lot of free time sometimes, and we talk about this stuff in our free time a lot. And yeah, we've definitely talked about this before.
This is like one of my favorites. I have said time and time again, if I could choose a way to die, it would be spontaneous human combustion.
Who wouldn't really?
Like, honestly, I mean, I feel like, you know, death to a certain extent is going to be painful in most circumstances. And realistically, like, this seems fairly, like, fast.
Quick.
Right. And then it's also kind of like, of course, I want to leave a little air of mystery, a little, you know, something to speculate on.
A little spooky.
Right. I have a Wikipedia article pulled up, and I kind of just reread it before coming in here, and it's basically trash. Like, I can just like recite everything on spontaneous human combustion at this point. Like, I don't have specific names or like times, but like all those other fine details I pretty much have. So this is one of those things where it's like, is it real? Is it not real? And I'm a firm believer that it is real. I think the people that are picking into it, it's like, sure, there could have been other things, but it's just very like, I feel like it's just as much of a stretch as spontaneous human combustion is a stretch, honestly. Although I did get one little grain of insight that I find absolutely hilarious to this, but I'm going to kind of get into what spontaneous human combustion is first of all. I think the name is very, like, obvious. It's just like you burst into flames. But the thing is these, sorry, that like threw me off. The thing is these cases are so odd in the sense of like other normal fires of like people catching on fire or burning. Partially because it's like they're not fully burnt sometimes. A lot of times like they have like a limb that's like completely untouched and uncharred, whereas like the rest of them burnt so badly that there's like their skulls shrunk, which in order to like shrink a human skull, you have to have like an insane amount of heat for an insane amount of time. Sometimes like really just honestly to burn a human body in general, like even if you were to be cremated, you know, like this is specially manufactured to completely incinerate a human body. It takes several hours, at an incredibly high heat, and to have someone like burst into flames for a relatively short amount of time for a fire, and completely incinerate everything, but leave like a stack of newspapers completely unburnt, like right next to them. It's like it doesn't have that time, it doesn't have that heat. You know, it's hard to believe that it's some external source, which is always the claim. It's always like, well, maybe, you know, some ash like flew through the window from somebody's pipe and like caught their clothes on fire and then they suddenly burned to death. And it's kind of like, really? Like that's your theory? Like,
but it would like start the whole house on fire.
Right, but it didn't. Like, that's the whole thing. Is it's like that's why I believe in it, personally. Although I know, just in general, we're bringing ideas that we don't necessarily believe
Unless
in.
there's
We just
some
find
like
interesting.
like supernatural.
That is one of the theories. One of the theories, like a legitimate theory by like an actual person that is like listed in here, is that these are poltergeists,
Oh,
and that it's like a spiritual thing, and then like your poltergeist like sets you on fire, like evilly, which I find incredibly laughable, but interesting theory for this possible explanation behind spontaneous human combustion.
who knows, man?
There is something called the wick effect or candle effect, which is honestly a little gruesome, so I apologize in advance. You might want to skip ahead if you're like not into gory details. But basically, it's kind of along the lines of like somehow, one of the more noticeable cases was a woman who was sitting in her armchair and did have a stack of newspapers next to her, and she, caught on fire, but like not a whole lot else in her apartment was on fire. Like part of her chair burned, yes, but again, it was not like the whole chair, which I feel like chairs are fairly flammable, armchairs especially with all that fabric. And then like the newspapers sitting like right next to it were untouched. It was really only her. And I think it's interesting too that there's cases of like people's glasses completely surviving and like other like somewhat flammable multiple objects
Or like,
being
didn't you say one
untouched.
like burnt out of their shoes and their shoes were completely like there?
Right, right. But that goes on to the fact also that sometimes people's feet and hands are like just they don't burn. Which interesting. I don't know if that was specifically the case in that one, but again, it's like weird. Although it kind of makes sense because there have been studies about decomposition and the human body, and the human body is actually not flammable. It's a low heat that it burns at. It doesn't spread. We're not flammable,
Or like 90% water.
which makes sense. Like a lot of times when people catch on fire, it's like they're in a burning building, they're trapped, or like their clothes are on fire. It's never truly they themselves are on fire. It's something else that has ignited them, and yeah. So it's such an interesting theory. But some of the more gruesome ones are the fact that in this theory, this is kind of more of the like reasonable ones. Is let's say you're old and have issues and you took some sleeping pills, but you're also a smoker and an alcoholic, and you kind of like passed out while smoking your cigarette, and it like fell on you, and you caught on fire, and then you just didn't wake up because you have like whatever issues going on, or your sleeping pill for some reason is much stronger than increasing on pain. I don't know. And so as you're burning and you're sitting on this armchair full of fabric, your fat melts a little bit and then soaks into that fabric, which then itself is kind of like a candle where it doesn't necessarily burn, but it keeps the flame alive. And then it only in turn like burns more of your fat, which goes back into the couch and just kind of keeps going as like this wick effect or candle effect. So it's, and like I said, it's gross. It's not a fun one, which I suppose that makes sense, but it's also kind of like if the chair isn't on fire because it's like the wax part of it, and people can't just like be on fire. Like,
is it like burning inside of you?
Well, that's what most people say. A lot of people who have witnessed it said that it looked like there was flames shooting out of people's mouths or flames shooting out of people's abdomen. And one of the theories behind the abdomen is that a lot of these people were actually alcoholics. And this is a theory that I like that I was going to get into, which I find absolutely hilarious, is that when your body is in ketosis, which is something that can happen when you are an alcoholic or like severely under the influence, or obviously if you were on the keto diet, your body produces some sort of like shit in the liver, and it's highly flammable, and that could make sense where like that's where like the flames are shooting out of.
Ew.
So if we see an uptick in spontaneous human combustion due to the keto diet, I'm not saying I would find people's deaths funny, but I also would find that funny.
That would be hilarious.
like keto diet's causing spontaneous human combustion, like
like
what a
at least
headline.
you know how to go now. Haley.
What a headline. Like, I have to go keto first.
You would hate that.
I would hate that. I would never be keto. I don't like meat. It's personal preference, but it's also like it's largely the taste. I think a lot of people are like, oh, the animals, and it's like not that I don't care about that, not that that's not a factor, But it's truly like it tastes fucking disgusting. I don't like pieces of fat and like weird little tendons and like it's gross, man. Like come on now. It's gross. If you thought the candle thing was gross and you eat meat, you're just as gross, my dude.
I'm sorry, but I really like my hamburger.
It's disgusting though. It's just ooh.
All right.
But that's most of it. There's several people. There was somebody even as recently as the 80s that this happened to, and that's where that theory where they tried to dispel it was like someone recently ashed their pipe, but it had been enough time before they had caught fire that they had freshly packed new tobacco in their pipe, and so it's like it took that long for that ash to like that was still ignited to like wait until you packed your new pipe. Before like floating across the house to somebody's clothes. Right. I feel like the whole spontaneous human combustion thing is more likely given the fact that there's just weird shit that happens in your bodies, man.
It's true. So what's your next one?
Next one is a doozy. Oof.
I already talked a lot on myself.
Yeah, this one I know, and I was like, I'm going to be getting into like a lot.
It's like maybe part 3.
I know, no. I mean, I'll try to sum this up. It's incredibly interesting. Unlike the Dyatlov Pass incident where the Wikipedia article is basically trash, and I would highly recommend Aaron Minky's lore episode. Yeah. This, on the other hand, this Wikipedia article is incredibly just rich with information. I would highly recommend the Wikipedia article. This is about the Sodder children disappearance. I find it also interesting that is what the article is titled, given the fact that the disappearance itself is what is in question. It wasn't like the Sodder children death, and then like here's some side theories about maybe their disappearance and they're really alive. It's like, no, this is the disappearance, which is what we're getting into. So it's a lot of background to fill you in. So this is about an Italian immigrant family. The parents were the immigrants. These children were born in the United States, but like first generation Italian Americans, and they lived in a community in West Virginia or something along those lines, where it was a very high concentration of Italian American immigrants. And this family in specific, George Sodder, the father, he was very outspoken and opinionated about a lot of different topics. Specifically, this was about the 40s or 50s. The Italian dictator Mussolini and his he was against him, very, very outspoken against him, and that created a lot of commotion within their local community of other Italians who did support Mussolini. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of where it's like, okay, understanding that this is an outspoken family, they were not shying away from their beliefs, and a lot of people were angered by this. I think setting that up is important. And then on top of it, understanding that leading up to this incident, this was not 1943. I believe it was 1945. 1945 is when this incident specifically happened. So there was a life insurance inspector, like a traveling, they come to your doorstep. This is kind of about that time period. Came to their house trying to sell life insurance, and they were like, no, I think we're good. And this was another Italian living in their community that was the salesman, and he was so upset that they refused to do business with him. He said, your house is going to go up in flames, your family is going to die, you're going to regret this. This is because of all this shit you said about Mussolini, and something along, it was specifically like your house is going to go up in flames, which is very odd thing to say. Yeah. He said your children are going to be destroyed, your house is going to go up in smoke. There is somebody else who happened to come by their house and looked at their fuse boxes and were like, you need to get that checked out. That's going to cause an electrical fire like real soon. And the thing was, though, is the Sodders had just installed an electric stove, and they had the entire rewiring of their house redone and approved by the local fire committee or fire department. So it was up to par, brand new. This wasn't like some weird shoddy, like, oh, you need to update that. That looks sketch. It was like odd that multiple people were saying this out of context, given that like there shouldn't have been anything wrong with their house or their wiring, and it was actually like, well known that there wasn't anything wrong with their house or their wiring. On top of that, there was like a car that had been parked in front of their house, just like watching them, like several days. So this incident itself happened Christmas Eve of 1945, and their house did end up going up in smoke. So George and his wife had 10 children. Their eldest was actually enlisted in the service and was actually fighting in World War II, so he was not home. It was the two parents and their 9 children, their youngest child being 2, some of their oldest children about maybe like 23 that were still living at home. It was something along the lines where one of the older siblings, she worked at a local store. She had saved up, bought some presents for some of her younger siblings, and they, asked to kind of stay up and really just enjoy their Christmas. And their parents were like, okay, we're going to bed. Take care of yourselves once your older siblings go to bed. Like, the rest of you have to go to bed. And most of them lived in the attic. They had a bedroom in the attic. They did take the youngest, Sylvia, who was 2 at the time, to bed right away. What was interesting is at about 12:30 a.m., Jenny, George's wife, woke up to a phone call, and there was a woman on it who was asking for somebody that did not live there, a name they did not recognize, and there was like a really odd laugh and like some clinking of glasses, and it was just like, okay, I get it, it's Christmas Eve, but it's also like, this isn't the New Year's, like, who's clinking glasses at 12:30 making mysterious phone calls, right? Which, on top of it, I think it's very important to note that they received a phone call at 12:30 a.m. Make a note of that. Going on about half an hour later, 1 a.m., Jenny again was awakened by the sound of something hitting the roof with a loud bang and then kind of a bit of a rolling noise. She stayed up to kind of listen for a little bit, and then she was like, okay, that's not Santa's reindeer. I'm going back to bed. And then just maybe like 30 minutes later, I'm trying to figure out the timeline here. About 30 minutes later, there was smoke. They were awakened. They were able to get, their youngest child and a few of the other siblings out. I believe 4 of the children out of the house. And both the parents were able to get out of the house. The house was completely aflame. It looked like the fire had started from the roof. They had attempted to, contact the fire department. Their phone line was cut. Their electric was still on. They had lights on, able to get out of the house while the fire was burning when they first realized this. They tried to call out to their children in the attic, and the stairs were already aflame. They couldn't reach them. Despite this, though, some of them went to the neighbors. The neighbor's phone didn't work. There's somebody who happened to be driving by. They tried to reach to like a phone. It didn't work. Eventually, someone was able to run into literally the middle of the town and find a phone that was working and call the fire department. And again, this is all around like 1:30, maybe 2 a.m. The fire department themselves, they didn't show up until like probably 7 a.m., like hours later in the morning.
Really?
Well after the fire had stopped. The fire only lasted for like 45 minutes. Their entire house like burned down. When the fire department searched through the house, actually backtracking, I'm getting too far here. So still during the fire, they were like, okay, where is our ladder? Because they had a ladder propped up against their house. Mm-hmm. It was like not there. They later found it in a ravine, like 30 feet away from their house, which was odd. They tried to start their cars. They had 2 trucks on their property. They tried to start both of those trucks in order to like get them up so they could climb up at a higher advantage to potentially get to the second story to reach their children. Neither of them would start. Again, going back to the whole phone thing, when they did receive a phone call earlier that night and it didn't work. It's all incredibly odd. Yeah, they tried everything they could possibly do. They tried it all, and eventually they basically just had to wait and watch their house burn, assuming that their children were dead inside. So afterwards, the fire marshal and everybody was there investigating the house fire, and they again claimed, oh, it was probably electrical in nature. Which with electrical fires, the lights go out, like your actual electric stops working fairly early in that fire process, and the fact that they're able to use the lights to escape from their house was suspicious. On top of the fact that the electrical fire would have started on a lower level, not the roof. And then like that odd clinking sound when they were going through the rubble, not initially but later on, there was an odd like little canister kind of ball like thing that they found that really resembled like a hand grenade, something on those lines, a small explosive device. And then on top of it, despite the fact that 5 of those children supposedly died in the attic, there was no bones found. There is no remains. And this goes back to the human combustion thing where it was like, this fire did not burn long enough. It did not burn hot enough. There would have bare minimum been bones left over. They actually did research and they looked at similar house fires. All of the bones were 100% intact. They could find like almost absolutely nothing. They claimed to have found a few organs, like some hearts, and they just didn't tell the family, including George, the father. I understand like the 50s, maybe you don't tell Jenny, but they didn't tell George either that they found supposedly some of their children's like organs. And one like fireman had saved the heart and then like put it in a box and like buried it in his yard, and they later dug it up. They ran tests on it, and it was not a human heart. It was like a beef liver. And it had never been exposed to fire. It was like completely alive right there that they found evidence of these children in there. They eventually the Sodders did fill in their basement because they had a basement like the whole with dirt, and they built a garden as a memorial for their lost children. And when they did kind of go through and dig through that, they did find some back vertebrae, like just a couple, like 2 little tiny bones. And they did immediately send that off. But again, it was odd that they didn't find a full skeleton. Those bones had never been exposed to fire and were potentially from the dirt that they used to fill in. It was of an older person, a person like a full-grown adult, based on like the fusion of like the back vertebrae, that sort of thing. And these were all children that were upstairs. The oldest of them was like 13, and would not have had their back fused in the same way. So that's the thing. There was reports of again that car. So there was that mysterious car right outside that had been watching them. One of their neighbors said that there was that same car outside their house during the fire, and there was children in, like a few children in there for sure. There have been reports of like nearby towns where the same night an Italian family, 2 adult men, 2 adult women, and some children were checked in. There's only one man that spoke, and when they asked about the children, something along those lines, they tried to talk to one of the hotel employees tried to say something to one of the kids, and he immediately turned around, looked at the child, and spoke in Italian to everybody else, and everybody else clammed up, and they refused to speak to the hotel worker, which is incredibly odd. There's again reports of like similar looking.
Is this family Italian?
Yes, this family is Italian. So the theory behind this is that a different Italian family started this fire, but took the kids out before the fire started, ensuring their safety, as basically just to like hurt George. Like, your house went up in smoke. Like, we're not evil enough to like kill your children. We'll get them out first before we start it. But like, yeah, we're kidnapping them. Like, we're taking your children. Like, because of what you said about Mussolini.
Damn.
Right, because it was like other Italian families. There's like reports of them eating at like diners of children that looked very, very similar to those missing. The Sodder family eventually was like, okay, our kids didn't die in this fire. We're like pretty sure now. Because at first they believed it. Like, initially they were like so heartbroken for their children. And it was like after these things didn't add up that then they started to believe that their children were not in there. In the house, so to speak, that they didn't perish in there. At this point, they bought a billboard. They hired a private investigator into the matter. They had the billboard of all their children's faces offering a cash reward for their return or information on this. And this is again where people are like, okay, that's why they recognize them and recognize these children. They'd seen pictures. There have been some odd things throughout the years. So when they hired the personal investigator, he looked into it so that insurance salesman that said that their house would go up in smoke and their children would, I don't know, something along the lines of like, you know, like your children are gonna pay and like blah blah blah. It's such an odd threat. Well, that man who had it out against them clearly already was on the commission that deemed the fire electrical in nature, and that the children for sure 100% died in the house. Like, he was part of that deciding factor, which is incredibly odd, and it was originally hid from the family before, like, this private investigator had to be able to tell them. So that's incredibly odd. Later, like, several years later, when one of the children would have been about 30, there was a picture sent to the house with no return address that kind of was like, this is, you know, so-and-so, little Georgie Jr., 30 now, he lives in this city, he's doing okay. And this family, they hunted down people. If they saw someone in a newspaper clipping that looked like it could be potentially their child, they would go and they would, like, beg to see them. And most of the time, these people, like, refused to even meet with them, or they would just say, like, oh, no, of course I'm not the kidnapped child. But it's also kind of like, there's a theory that these children thought that their parents died in the fire, and that in order to keep themselves safe, they just never even thought to look for their parents again, or that they thought that something else would happen and then they really would be killed if they did say something. So that's kind of one of the theories of, like, why they maybe wouldn't have come forward themselves. But yeah, it's just, to this day, that family is still, at this point, it's like the grandchildren, the children of the children. Sylvie, who was 2 at the time, is, I think, still alive. She might be the last alive children from that time frame. But their children, they eventually took down that billboard, but they kept that billboard up until about, maybe Sylvie did die, until about Sylvie's death. But that their family, the Sauter family, still continues to this day to search for their lost aunts and uncles that they believe are still alive. That family believes to its core they're actually intentionally trying to publicize this story. So I would highly encourage anybody to look into this. It's not only a fascinating story, but this is actually one of those rare occurrences where the family does want you to know about this. They want you to look into this. I think a lot of times these, like, topics, it's like nobody wants to hear about this story. It's very disrespectful for the family, and I by no means mean to drudge up any of that, but it is fascinating. I like oral tradition. I like hearing about these stories, and it's kind of fun to have a story that the family wants to be heard, you know, to really relish in this and get that out there.
Especially if, like, it could help.
Right.
The missing people.
Yeah, so
imagine the power of the internet. I mean, dang.
For real. Yeah, their one surviving daughter, along with their grandchildren, have continued to publicize the case in the media and online. So
wow,
I'd highly look into it. It's Sodder, Sodder, children disappearance. Incredibly interesting story. There's so much more that goes into this. I would really recommend reading into it.
Well, that's our conspiracy theories for tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are so many more. I still have, like, a bunch on my list that I could totally talk about.
I could find so many more myself. I don't have anything picked out, but I could find some.
But anyway, thanks for hanging out with us and listening to us, you guys. I hope you liked this podcast. If you did, give it a like and give it a share and subscribe. All right, have a good night. Bye. Bleepers.
Exactly.
Bloopers.
Bleepers. That just became a bleeper within itself.
Shut up. Hello. Hello. You're smiling at the camera?
Yes. Okay. The camera.